Yo, ho, ho, ho. We saying. Um, yeah, let me get a bit closer to the mic so you can hear me properly. Yeah. We're gonna talk about the aloneness argument while I'm playing my game because one, I'm bored, and two, I want to play my game while I'm talking about it. Because one of you said that I should make a response to the argument. And I've made so many videos to the argument. I made these like 2 years ago. And they pick and choose when they want to make these arguments popular. So I'm just gonna address the argument for now. Save the video so you guys could, watch it for yourself. And we're gonna talk about the argument. The argument is so bad. It's actually funny because the argument could be refuted in literally 2 sentences, but it's whatever. We're gonna steal man the strongest version of the argument, represent the argument in the strongest form, and then I'm gonna show you guys why it's false. Okay. So first off, I want you guys to realize that I'm gonna show the strongest version of the argument, the one that everyone talks about on TikTok, because I know you guys want to do your little apologetics and debunk these guys or whatever. So you have to understand that the argument is coming from the perspective that, look, God exists, and in this world that he exists, he's alone in this world, meaning it's only God in this particular domain of objects that really exists, which is a very weird, way to speak, but we're not gonna harbor too much on what they mean. We already understand what they're trying to say. All they're trying to say is, look, if it is possible that God can exist without creation, then in this world, God knows that he is by himself without creation. So that's premise one of the argument. So premise one, God's knowledge that he is alone is real. Meaning, in this world that God exists, right? And let me know if my mic is messed up or something like that, because play low normal mode. No, I'm not playing low normal mode. I like playing TFT. I'm sorry, but just to stick to the point for you guys. So God's knowledge that he is alone is real. That's premise one. Okay. Premise one: God's knowledge that he is alone is real. What they mean by this is, what they mean by this is, if God creates a world and he's the only one that exists in that world, then God would know that he exists alone. Fine. Completely fine. Fine. Let's grant them that. The second premise is, what is this? My radio album. So the second premise is this: if God is simple and God's knowledge is real, then God's knowledge is simple and identical to God. Fine. These seem at first, all these premises, right, that they give, that they used to argue against the Trinity, at first they seem very simple. They seem like, okay, how can I reject this? But just watch the satanic deception. Just watch it. So the second premise is, if God is simple, which we agree with, divine simplicity, then God's knowledge is real. It is identical to God. What are you talking about? This is the second premise. The second premise already has problems. But it has problems, but it sounds like it makes sense. If God's knowledge is real, then it's identical to God. The problem is, for the scholastics, for any pre-modern cognitive theorist about the divine knowledge, when you say God's knowledge is X and it is identical to God, that makes no sense. Because God's knowledge is literally just God being himself. Like, that's what it is. God's knowledge is him just literally, the way that I'm like a human being, just like literally existing as a human being, is the way that God knows things, just by existing. So that's one. But they're gonna say it's semantics, it's Thomism, it's this, it's Eastern, always all this weird stuff, always saying it's pretty simple. Fine. So grant them that. Don't harbor on that. Don't stick on that second premise. Grant it to them. Leave it. So the second premise is God's knowledge is that God's is simple, God's knowledge is real, and it's identical to God. Fine. Now, the problem is the third premise where it says, if God's knowledge that he is alone is identical to God, then that knowledge is necessary. It's quite obvious to see the problem now, because in the beginning, we told them, hey, look, we don't want you using this language because it ill conceives what we mean when we say God's knowledge. But then they tell us, oh, but all we're saying is something simple. But then the third premise harbors on the assumptions in the second premise to make the third premise, and the third premise is just false. The reason why their third premise is false when they say God's knowledge that he is alone is identical to God and that knowledge is necessary is because the proposition God is alone, right, doesn't exist as some cognitive item in God's mind. It's in reality, it's nothing, right? And there's a difference between... Who is making that noise? There's a difference between... Hey, can you... Thank you. Yeah, so there's a difference between de re necessity and de dicto necessity. I can't put my camera on right now. I'm getting a webcam like next week, but there's a difference between de re and de dicto necessity. So de dicto necessity is about like propositions, statements, proposition statements, the necessity of a statement, of the truth of the statement or something like that. That's de dicto necessity. De re necessity is about what something is in reality, right? So like I'm not necessary de re because I'm a contingent being, but God is necessary de re because he's a necessary being. So they want to say that because God's... What the heck did they just give me, bro? What? Yo. Anyways, yeah, I lost this game. But they want to say that because God's knowledge that he is alone is identical to him and the knowledge is necessary, right? Then there would be a contradiction because the fact that God is alone is not necessary. The fact that God is alone is contingent, right? It's not necessary for God to be alone. And we know that because we exist. So that's the contradiction there. So they want to say that the only way you can account for this is by rejecting divine simplicity, by saying that God is not divinely simple. So that God knows contingent things because he himself can change. He himself, his mind can change about these propositions. The rebuttal to this is very simple. Very, very simple. So, first off, two problems. The first problem is God's knowledge that he is alone in reality is nothing. It's called a negative ontological item. So it's not a real thing. So when you have de re modal operators, de re modal operators are being attached to real things. That's why it's called a de re modal. It's saying something about the way this thing is in reality. But God's knowledge that he is alone is not anything like affirmative in reality, because there's nothing about... Ooh, my microphone. Sorry. Because there's nothing about there's nothing that differs between God's knowledge in this world and God's knowledge in the alone world. It would still be the same knowledge. Why? Because God's knowledge is formally defined as himself. Just the act of his being. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ooh. So, if God's knowledge is defined as himself and the act of his being, the question is, does God have himself and the act of his being in all these other possible worlds? The answer is yes. If it is yes, then that part is already gone. The part that God has this sort of contingent knowledge. He would only have contingent knowledge if he differs in all these other possible worlds. But he doesn't differ in all these other possible worlds. Sorry. So he does not have that contingent knowledge. What's their response? Their response is that we're just begging the question, because that's obviously, what they're trying to argue against. But the fundamental point of that statement that I just made is that, first off, we know that God's knowledge that he is alone is something that we affirm of God, but not something real in God. So, for example, if you have a house and you have a universe, there's nothing that exists in the universe except a house, right? The house exists by itself. That would be the alone world of the house. But if you put something beside the house, like let's say you put a car beside the house in that alone world, right? The house would no longer be alone to us because the car is beside the house. So there's a relationship the car has with the house that distinguishes the car from the house, right? So that world, the car would exist, the house, ouch, hold on. In that world, the car would exist and the house would exist. The car is not identical to the house. The car would, let's just say the car is on the left side of the house. Now, the reason why we know this is because of something called extrinsic predication. It's not because of anything inside the house that we know that the car is next to the house. It's only because of the relationship the car has to the house. The same way that when we say that God's knowledge that he is alone, we know that God is alone. That's only because of the relationship he has to this world. That's not anything intrinsic about God. It's entirely in the relationship. Right? So if it's entirely in the relationship, then it can't be identical to God, because a relation cannot be identical to itself. For example, like what's an example of a relation? The relation gravity has with something. So the relation gravitational force has on an object and the space-time field, right? So if I'm falling down, I'm always going to have a relationship between, up and downwards, where I'm falling downwards, right? Am I identical to the relationship between up and down? Of course not. But the relationship is only said about me extrinsically because of the gravitational force and the connection it has between me and the ground. Oops, my microphone again. And the connection it has between me and the ground, right? So if that's the case, and I'm actually going to screenshot the argument in a second. After I'm done with this game, I'm going to screenshot the argument to make it cleaner for you guys. But if that's the case, then one, we know that the relationship, right, that God has with the world is not intrinsic to God. So when they say God's knowledge is intrinsic to God or identical to God, that's just false. God does have the knowledge that he is alone, but the terms he is alone, like the idea of God knowing that particular proposition, he is alone, is only extrinsically predicated of God. It's not intrinsic to God. All that's intrinsic to God in reality is God knowing himself. And in every possible world, God would always know himself. If in an alone world, God would know himself. Why? Because only himself exists. In this world, God knows himself only. And they'll say, oh, but does God know President Trump, for example? Or does God know me and you? Yeah, he does. But he knows me and you because we are finite representations of himself. That's the whole point. Right? So, what do I do? Do I go like Dark Star Sniper? I don't know. So yeah. So remember, so God knows himself first and primarily, and then God knows all these other things through himself as some sort of like axiom. You know this the same way, like for example in mathematics, how we get the 1 + 1 is 2 and all those type of like equations is because of like axioms called the Peano's axiom, which gives us the successor function and all that. And basically just by knowing the Peano's axioms, just by knowing those alone, literally we understand so many other equations just by knowing the axioms alone. So I know just by knowing the axioms alone that 6 + 6 is 12 and 12 + 12 is 24 and 24%, just from the axioms alone. The same way that God, just by knowing himself alone, his essence alone, right? He knows us and all these other things because we are like the equations that follow from his essence, the same way the mathematical equations follow from the axioms. So when they say that God is alone and this thing's going to be identical to him, is going to be intrinsic to him, it's like, no, it's not going to be identical to him or intrinsic to him. It's only identical to him. Sorry, it's only said of him because of our perception of him and our perception of the world, but it's not something real or ontological in God. What the only thing that's real and ontological in God is God's knowledge of himself. Therefore, you cannot attach any Dirac modal operator. Why? Because Dirac modal operators only work on on real things. Because the Dirac modal operator is an ontological modal operator. But this thing isn't even real. It's nothing. So what are you attaching the modal operator to? So the way you're gonna debunk aloneness argument is by asking the interlocutor this. Okay, you said God is alone and you said this knowledge is identical to him. Oh, fine. When you say this knowledge is identical to him, is this thing that's identical to him real in reality? Yes or no? Obviously, if they say yes, then they're dumb because they're not still manning that's not our position. So just say, no, that's not our position. If they say no, then they're not, oops, my microphone. If they say no, then they're not talking about anything, right? Because if it's nothing in reality, then there's nothing you're attaching the Dirac modal operator to. So if it's nothing in reality, there's nothing necessary there. Ouch. And that's the whole point. Right? So that's the first problem with the what's it called? With the aloneness argument. That's the first problem. That's why it doesn't work. And that's why a lot of them have dropped it. It's not that popular anymore. This was spoken about like 2 years ago. It's just they don't understand our position. It's just a misunderstanding of our position. That's literally what it is. It's a misunderstanding of our position. I'm gonna pull up the arguments, because I know like some of you are gonna watch this after the live or something like that. Let me find it. Let me open my Discord. But that's why it never worked. That's why I'm always so confused when you guys say, okay, with sniper. when you guys say, "Oh, like I don't know how to respond to this," like it never worked, bro. Nobody uses this argument anymore. Oh, if someone walks up to you and says, "Look, aloneness argument," just say, "Cool. Is the proposition God's knowledge that He is alone, a real thing in God? Yes or no?" And then it's GG's. I literally have a whole TikTok conversation on this with a guy called Reductio on TikTok, and basically I spoke to him about this, and I showed him where he's just like he's just misrepresenting our position. It's a long conversation someone posted on TikTok that they sent to me. Oh, I'm losing this game bad. Oh my gosh. What am I even doing? What even is my comp at this point, bro? Do you play classic? I don't play classic league. I mean, I do play classic league. I do play classic league, but I don't think I can play that right now because I don't have good Wi-Fi. But and I'm also not in America. But yeah, so that's the first problem with the aloneness argument. So that one's done. That one's done and debunked. Okay. The second argument we're gonna debunk, I'm gonna express to you guys is the um and by the way, just to make it super clear, if they say they're not talking about their ray necessity, then literally they're not talking about. And by the way, if they're not talking about anything, if they're not talking about their ray necessity, they're not talking about anything because they dicto necessity is just about. That would be similar to what they're actually talking about. But then that wouldn't even mean anything because then all would be saying is that it's necessarily true that God knows himself, or that God, if it's de dicto necessity, then all would be saying is that it's necessarily true that God knows that he's alone. That's it. You wouldn't get God being alone, like that thing is identical to him. Like in knowledge. You wouldn't get that if they're not talking about their necessity. Because they dicto necessity is just saying the truth of this statement is necessary. So it's necessarily true that 1 + 1 is 2. That doesn't mean that 1 + 1 is identical to 2. Even though like conceptually it is, right? But you get the point. Like there's counter examples where something can be necessarily true, but it's not just because something is necessarily true, that's not an identity statement. Do you get what I'm saying? So if it's a de dicto necessity, they're not saying anything meaningful. They're just saying it's necessarily true that God knows that he's alone, which we agree with in that possible world. But it's going to be their necessity. That's what they're arguing for. Where they want to say that God knows him, God knowing that he's alone is necessary and identical to him. And it just doesn't follow. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because God knowing that he's alone, qua him alone, is not anything in us. It's not anything in him. It's only something in us and our conception of him. What's another example? You know how like when you like the sun when it shines and the rays like the gravity pulls the rays to the earth and we try to perceive the sun through the rays. The rays aren't anything, well, the rays in this sense, like in the way that we perceive it, aren't anything in the sun, right? The sun is somehow quasi incomprehensible. Like you can't really see the essence of the sun, but this example is a bit more difficult because it's used for God's essence. I'm not super sure how to use it for his knowledge, but yeah, it's just like it's a category error. It's a category error. Let me actually screenshot right now. Okay. I'll put on Discord. I'm gonna literally show all the best arguments against divine simplicity and like literally debunk them one by one. Literally debunk them one by one. Hold up. Because I can't be making videos about these all the time. If anyone asks me a question, I'll just direct them to this video. Okay, so okay, finally. And then window capture. Okay. So the argument is this. This is such a and I'm gonna add the guy that asked me to address this. So yeah, so God's knowledge that he is alone is real, right? And then if God is simple, God's knowledge is real, it is identical to God. Like what when they say if God is simple and God's knowledge is identical to God's knowledge is identical to God, all they're saying is God is God. God is God. Okay, so that's one. And because God being alone is not something is not a positive ontological item in God. So we already brushed past that. I think many like people like Thomas himself would even say like this argument is not that good. So he pivots to the other argument, the one that he gives here. Let me send it to you. Let me show it. Sorry, so send it. I wish I titled this debunking all the arguments to divine simplicity, but I'm gonna do that later one day, like probably tomorrow or something. So he gives a more I would say a better argument against divine simplicity here. And he says if a cognitive content is identical to God, then the content exists with the same modal status as God. That is, it's absolutely necessary. If a cognitive content, like premise 1 is already false. Premise 2 is false. Conclusion 1 is false. Premise 3 is false. Premise 4 is false. Conclusion 2 is false. Like the whole thing is false. And he took his time on making this argument. So he says in premise 1, if a cognitive content, well, that's already grammatically incorrect, because when he says if a cognitive content, he's assuming that there's a bunch of cognitive content and he's picking out one. The reason why I say that is because in premise 2 he says on classical theism, all of God's cognitive contents. That's already false. And this is why I always tell them that I hate the word content, because they don't understand what they're talking about. There's no multiplicity in God's cognition, because the only thing that God knows is himself, is his essence. The same way that from a tautology, you know that contradictions cannot occur, right? Let's just say, so in logic, we have this thing called the law of identity. The law of identity, A is A, and then a contradiction, A cannot be A and not A at the same time in the same respect. From just knowing that A is A, you already reject a contradiction. You already like concede that there can't be contradiction of the law of identity, right? So God knowing himself is what he knows. All these other things that we want to say he knows, like God knowing Veritas, God knowing you, God knowing a chair, God knowing the Pope, are extensions of just God knowing himself. But then they don't exist in God as different features of his knowledge. All that exists in God as a feature of his knowledge is the knowledge of himself, of his own essence. And that's the whole point. So that's already like done. So premise 2 is false. Therefore, all of God's cognitive contents are absolutely necessary. False. But I suppose what he wants to say, instead of like harboring on this point, what he wants to say is that whatever God knows is absolutely necessary. Why is that even true? Whatever God knows is absolutely necessary. That's not even true. Like, God knows contingent things. Keep in mind, by contingent, all we mean is that it could or could not exist. Knowing something is not tied to its existence. You could know, there's so many things you could know. You could know a unicorn, I suppose, or like some fantasy type of character that doesn't exist. So you can know things that are contingent. Contingency here just means it can exist or not exist. So, if by conclusion 1 he means that whatever God knows is absolutely necessary, then that's just false. And he's grounding that in the content being identical to God, but it's not a positive ontological thing that has to have the same de re modal status as God. So that's another fallacy. So if he says, oh yeah, like, but it is going to be like necessary because it's identical to God, no, because the content is not a positive ontological thing. It's nothing in reality. It's nothing. It's only something because of how we think about it. It's nothing in reality. So if it's nothing in reality, what are you saying is necessary? What are you talking about? So, and then they're going to be like, oh, so you're saying God knows nothing? I'm not saying God knows nothing. What God really and truly knows ontologically is himself. All these other things that we want to say that God knows differently, like President Trump, me, you, and all these things, are things that we put onto God, but aren't really and truly intrinsic to God. They're only extrinsically denominated of God. And then they say, okay, so God doesn't really know Trump. He does, because Trump is a representation of his essence, and Trump like contracts a certain, form of one of the divine ideas. But what ontologically is occurring is just God knowing himself. So this whole argument is bad. So these two arguments, this argument and the aloneness argument, are bad arguments because they don't represent the scholastic or the Eastern view on God's cognition at all. So that's why these two arguments do not work. And like the aloneness, they don't run it anymore, and they know why they don't run it. It's because it's a bad argument. Literally, it's not popular anymore. It's been debunked. I don't know about any other popular objection to divine simplicity. I'm not really sure about any other popular. There was the one that was going about where Ian, there's this like atheist guy very popular on TikTok. His name is Ian, and he basically was debating someone, and I remember him saying something like Catholicism is false because we're saying that God is divinely simple, but how can God be divinely simple and know things that are changing without changing? I'm like, are you dumb? Oh my god. I'm like, bro, are you dumb? Like, you can obviously, like, first off, there's two states of time. There's the eternal state of time that God has where everything is eternally present to him. And then there's the temporal revelation of that time made manifest to man. And so in the eternal state of time, God sees and knows and sees everything from eternity, and he knows everything that's going on without changing. But from the revelation of that succession of time to man, right, with change and corruption and all that stuff, yet man becomes you know, like we see it as God, you know, changing and or whatever, but it's not, because from God's eternal state, from God's eternal presence, he sees. The way that God knows things is just by seeing. The way that God knows things is the way that we see stuff. So it's called knowledge of vision. So the way that God knows things is literally analogous to how we see things. We just open our eyes and look around, and we could just abstract all this information. Is the way that God just, in a certain sense, opens his eyes and looks around. So yeah, so that part is bad. So yeah, God can know things that are changing because there's two orders of priority. So that one is there. And what's the other? Yeah, I don't think there's any other like really good one right now that's popping. Ryan Mullins. I don't remember him giving any like version of the aloneness argument, but that's this one sorted. That's the aloneness argument about. So if someone comes to you, so again, someone comes to you with the aloneness argument, you say to the person, "Hey, is the proposition or the fact God is alone, is that a positive ontological intrinsic feature to God?" The person has to say no, because that's your position. If he says yes, just say that's not my position. If he says no, you say, look, if it's not a positive ontological feature in God, then God is not like that thing is not absolutely necessary, because you're just saying that nothing is absolutely like you're just saying nothing is absolutely necessary. That's all you're saying. Because that's what it is in reality. It's nothing. It's only something that we put onto God to understand him. It's called extrinsic denomination, but in reality it's nothing. So that's why premise premise 2, premise 3 doesn't work. Premise 2, premise 3 doesn't work. And premise 4 is also weird, because God's knowledge that he is alone is in the alone world, it's going to be necessary. So premise 4 is also false. Premise 4, God's knowledge that he is alone in the alone world is going to be conditionally necessary. It's going to be necessary in the condition that he is going to be true in that alone world. But that's irrelevant to the refute in this argument. To refute this argument, just say, look, the array operators are attached to real ontological items. The proposition God is alone in his knowledge is not a real ontological item, but it's only something we say of God. Therefore, the array modal operators cannot be attached to that proposition. Okay, so yeah, I'm gonna post this because you guys was asking me under my some of the people, it wasn't a popular request, but some people were asking me, yeah, like respond to the aloneness argument, and all of that, and that's what I did. Yo, welcome back, by the way. What happened to all your old videos? Did you take them down? If so, why? Is it related to your vacillations between Catholic scholasticism, Reformed theology, and other nuances? Okay, welcome, Ryan. I took down some of my old videos because one, I think some of them were not, they were unfruitful. Some of them were unfruitful. Back then I was really prideful. And also like they were also like extremely poor production quality too. It's not like now I don't have the best quality now, but you know, kind of bad. And I don't want to be like teaching people Reformed theology like that, because I'm not sure, but I think the Reformers are wrong about concupiscence. And so if that's the case, then I'll just be teaching people like falsehood, and I don't want to do that. That would literally be the direct opposite of my name, Veritas. So I don't want to do that. So that's why I took down a lot of the videos. But yeah, that's why I took them down. But I don't know. I was even thinking of like dividing my channels and making like cool, like Veritas on theology. So this channel is just gonna be like theology, history, all that like interesting stuff, and then Veritas apologetics, where I'm like actually debating people. And then like, yeah, I would like make that for you guys. That's what I was thinking. But I don't know. Because some people want to see me debate, some people want to see me, I don't know. Like, I don't really understand what you guys like. I have a really different variable audience. But yeah, that's the aloneness argument debunked. Something that's not a thing cannot have a array operator attached to it. So that's really it debunked. I guess what they would ask you though is, okay, so then how is it that God's knowledge that he's alone is nothing? And what you're going to respond to them is by saying, look, God's knowledge that he is alone, right, is not nothing. It's true, but he is alone is not something in like, it's not something ontologically intrinsic to God. So God knows that he's alone. That's true. Like, I know my mom loves me, but my mom loving me is not ontologically intrinsic to me. It's extrinsic to me. I know that because of the relationship I have with my mom. Did you get it? It's so simple. This argument is so simple. It's the most silly, one of the most trash arguments ever used against divine. Like, it's so bad. And they don't use it anymore. So that's it. Like, yeah, it's not some positive ontological item in God. It's nothing. When you say it's absolutely necessary, you're just saying nothing is absolutely necessary. GG's, that's a concession. You could even do rhetoric. You could just say, in my position, is this something or is it nothing? You say it's nothing. So you're just saying nothing is absolutely necessary. GG's. Like, bro, there's so many ways. And the best way, oh, my microphone again. Oh my gosh. In my honest opinion, your old videos were really helpful to me. Though the production style wasn't the best. I think a lot of people would benefit from seeing your intellectual/spiritual journey. Okay. I see. It's just like, I don't have a church yet. So I think it would make more sense if I release those old videos if I'm confirmed in the Catholic Church. But if I'm not confirmed in the Catholic Church, I don't think it makes that much sense for me to release the old videos, because then it's like, oh, this guy's inquiring towards Catholicism, leaning towards Catholicism, but you never truly know. And then it's just gonna be like more, theological confusion, I guess. But I one by one, I will slowly like open up some of the old videos. I'll slowly open up like my hijab one. Like if you check my channel, I've opened up one of the most, like Zakir Naik. I opened up that one. So yeah. And then I'm gonna hop back on camera again and do all that by next week, because I need to get some equipment, a better camera, laptop, all that. You know what I'm saying? You get me? God necessarily wills objects to be contingent. Exactly. That's another thing. God from eternity has willed this and this thing to either exist or not exist, and he can do that. Do you know how Aquinas shows that God could do that? So take, for example, you want to smoke a cigarette because you're useless, for example. So you have a cigarette, you take a match. Sometimes when you take the match, you could fail to light it up. You could fail or succeed. Like when you use the match and you try to flicker, like light up your cigarette, it could fail or succeed. And that's because of the failure of human causation. But because God has infinite power, then God could succeed in making something fail or succeed because of his infinite surplus of power. So it would be the direct opposite for God. So, because that was another thing though. People were asking, oh, how is it the case that God could make this thing exist or not exist? It's either that he makes, because existence, it doesn't exist on degrees or whatever. We could give examples of where something could fail to exist or not exist by causal efficacy. But the examples that we give from contingent creation is just going to be like examples from failure. Like I failed to light up the cigarette. But from God, they're going to be examples of success because he has infinite powers. He has an infinite surplus of power. So he can make something exist or not exist because his power is infinite. And there's no like metaphysical impossibility. Do you get me? But yeah, like I'm gonna soon, release some of my old videos one by one. And forgive me guys, but I'm gonna stop the stream for like 2 minutes and change the title to Q&A so that I could address any argument that you guys are struggling with or trying to do anything like that. I could address that rather than, I just wanted to make this video for a specific subscriber that was asking me. So I'm gonna change it to Q&A now, and literally any like questions or answers, I could literally give it to you guys. Okay, so I'll be